Hello loves, welcome back or welcome to the channel. I'm back to another episode specifically of Kylie talking about an oddly specific subject for way too long. But I am legitimately so excited about today's topic because this is something or someone that I've wanted to talk about like from the beginning. When I made this channel, I knew I was going to make this video pretty soon. We are talking about one of my many Roman empires in history, and I have a lot, so this is going to be the first of many of these type of videos. But today, we are talking about Marie Antoinette, her life, her story, her tragedy. I made a lot of heavily detailed presentations and essays on Marie Antoinette while I was in school, like starting in middle school through high school type situation. And when I was researching for the video, I was trying to find these so I could pull some info from them. They all got deleted, so it's honestly kind of embarrassing how little research I had to do because I retained a lot of that information. So fair heads up though, this is definitely going to be a little different even in terms of our sit down videos that we've done in the past, because this is going to be essentially a very chatty history lesson. So if that's not your cup of tea, au revoir. If it is your cup of tea, let's get started. Our story begins in Vienna, Austria, which was where Marie Antoinette was born. Or better yet, Marie Antonia Josepha Johanna, which was her full name. But just for better understanding and for the sake of the video, I'm just going to call her Marie throughout the video. She was nicknamed Antoine by her family, and that was the name that she was really known by in her own home growing up. So Marie was born as a princess of Austria, and she was the 15th of 16 children born to her mother, Maria Theresa, and her father, Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. Empress Maria Theresa was really an amazing figure in herself. She ruled on her own without a husband by her side for many years. So when she married Francis, this really secured the dynasty of Habsburg-Lorraine, which are the two families that came together. And their marriage really was one of true love and true affection, which wasn't something that was super common during the time, especially with these high status, high aristocracy marriages. This wasn't something super common. And I think that the love that they had for one another definitely showed in the way that they raised their children and just the way that their children grew up and who they would also become. And the beginning of Marie's story is a really happy one. She grew up in the beautiful, I apologize, I may butcher this pronunciation, Schönbrunn Palace. I hope I did that right. So Marie and her sister Maria Carolina shared a governess in the palace, and they grew up side by side, and they were very close throughout childhood, and they would actually remain very close even as they left each other to follow their own lives. Marie received a very typical education for a young woman of her time. She learned about the arts. She was very gifted in music and instruments. She was said to have had a beautiful singing voice, and she would often serenade her family during dinner time. So she was very gifted in the arts, but she was not super gifted in reading and writing. She wasn't the brightest academically in that sense, but even though she wasn't the brightest among her siblings, she was known to be the kindest, the most beautiful, the most compassionate. She really was just seen as a very kind individual, especially among her family and people on staff in the palace, like her governess and the servants around. She was known to be this very kind person. And she was always very eager to do her part to help her family. But being the 15th of 16 children, she was kind of swept under the rug from a young age unintentionally, just because her older siblings were getting a lot of focus put onto them to be trained to be these highly marriageable individuals. They were going to be these important people who were going to marry the high status individuals, not only in Austria, but in surrounding countries. They would be the ones who would initiate peace treaties through their marriages. It was a very important thing. Marie wasn't really trained in the same way that her older siblings were, because she was so young and she was the 15th of 16 children. She was never intended to be that highly marriageable individual. She was never expected to be a great ruler, definitely not a queen. And I think that's part of what makes Marie's story such a tragedy from the very beginning, is she was never intended to be this high status royal bride, so she wasn't trained for it until very last minute, which we will discuss soon. The 12th child of the emperor and empress was named Marie Josepha. I apologize again. And she was engaged to King Ferdinand IV. But she would never get to marry him because she contracted smallpox and unfortunately passed away before they could be married. And this death of her sister really left a big impact on little Marie. She was pretty scarred by this, and it stuck with her, as was pretty well noted by her family members and members of the staff at the palace. So more and more of Marie's unmarried siblings began to die from the smallpox epidemic, and if they didn't die from the smallpox, then a lot of them were permanently disfigured by smallpox, and at this time that absolutely shattered their chances of marriage, and they were done. So all of the sudden, Marie is expected to fit into these high roles of power that her siblings no longer could fill. And she was terribly ill-prepared to be queen, especially the queen of a country in such chaos like France. When Marie was 13 years old, she was suddenly thrown into the deep end of all of this. She was engaged to the Dauphin of France. And yes, I understand that this wasn't terribly uncommon for such young girls to be engaged during this time period, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that she was a 13-year-old girl when she was engaged to be married to a Dauphin of France. That's big. And even though it was the cultural norm of the time, it doesn't change the fact that developmentally and cognitively, she was a child. That was a little girl. I really just think that this fact makes Marie's story even easier to empathize with. So Marie's mother, Maria Theresa, kind of scrambled into this French indoctrination for her daughter to quickly suit her for the life that was awaiting her. She was all of a sudden getting all these lessons on French culture and fashion, and she was taught to be submissive and agreeable in every situation, including with her future husband, of course. And Marie's fiance, Louis, was really going through the same thing. He was known to be kind of an introverted person. He would later become known as this kind of eccentric being for some of the choices that he made, but even during the time of their engagement, he was also being taught the same things as be submissive, be agreeable. Louis also never thought or was intended to become king as young as he did. Okay, so to better understand the couple's very sudden arrangement, let me explain the political situation that was going on between France and Austria. So the Habsburg Empire was ginormous, and it was only continuing to grow. And as this empire was expanding, it was getting uncomfortably close to France. And this was causing serious tension and rivalry between the two people. So the entire purpose of Marie and Louis's marriage was to appease this political tension. Marie was so young when she left for France. She was still only 14. Their engagement lasted for a year. But 14, she is sent away from her home, and there's kind of this grand ceremony that is held at the border of the two countries. And what Marie didn't know at the time was this would be the very last time that she would see her home in Austria. Marie was forced to leave behind literally everything from Austria, including her clothes, her Austrian name, her dog. And during this ceremony, she officially went from Marie Antoinette to Marie Antoinette. Marie was thrust into this lavish lifestyle of Versailles, and she was absolutely overwhelmed. Versailles was really like this own little ecosystem in itself. It was a city within its own walls. It had so many strange rules and societal expectations and ceremonial practices that, even though Marie had been quickly kind of French indoctrinated, she was not prepared for this. Marie and Louis could not do anything by themselves. They could not get dressed by themselves. They could not eat by themselves. They literally had to have an audience watch them while they were eating, and Marie was pretty quick to start doing some things about these things that she thought were absolutely absurd. She built a platform in the dining room so that a group of musicians could sit on it and serenade them and the people watching them while they were eating, so that Marie and Louis were not the sole focal point. Their servants couldn't even knock on their doors because it was seen as too disruptive. They had to scratch on the doors instead. Marie couldn't bathe alone, and later in life she was said to have started bathing in her chemise, which was an undergarment, and this was just her trying to hold on to 1 ounce of decency and privacy. So in the middle of all of this chaos, Marie was having a really difficult time adjusting to life at Versailles. And during this, there's also all of a sudden these very intense rumors that Marie is actually an Austrian spy, because remember, there's still some intense political tension going on around Marie and Louis, even though the marriage has happened. The first 7 years of Marie and Louis' marriage was rocky, to say the least. Louis was described to be an inattentive husband who just showed a lot of disinterest in Marie, and Marie was still really having a hard time adjusting to this new life in Versailles. Absolutely everything changed in 1774. On May 10th, Louis' grandfather, the King of France, died. Immediately, Marie's husband Louis would become king. Marie was only 18 and Louis was only 19. And this quote of Louis really solidifies of what I spoke of earlier, of how I think it's really easy to empathize with them just because of how young they were. They were just two ill-prepared kids who had no intention and no preparation to rule a country. Oh God, guide us and protect us. We are too young to reign. But as difficult as this was, it did cause Marie and Louis to grow closer. They formed a genuine affection for each other that I would describe to be similar to Marie's mother and father. They even welcomed their first child in December of 1778, daughter that they named Marie Therese. And though she wasn't the son that the royal family was hoping for and desperately needed at that time, Marie Therese was a clear sentiment of the couple's love for each other, and it definitely kind of settled things down a little bit among the French people and helped them to realize that this marriage was secure. So now, during this time, Marie has finally adjusted to life in Versailles, and she's starting to live comfortably. If you've ever seen photos of Versailles, it is quite a sight to behold. So, again, it is important to keep in mind that, yes, she enjoyed this lifestyle, but she didn't create it for herself. She was thrown into it. That would unfortunately be because of her husband's grandfather, the previous king of France, who had just died. He was said to have spent over half of the country's income on building and updating Versailles and keeping his lifestyle as lavish as it was. Because it being as lavish as it was not only a statement to the French people, but it was a statement to other countries. It was really just stating that authority. So even though Marie didn't create this lifestyle for herself, it was what was expected of her. It was what her mother had trained her to enjoy the French way, this French culture. This was the French way. Hello from Editing Kylie. Quick break from the video to discuss today's sponsor, EarthChimp. I only recently found EarthChimp, and I am so glad I did, because this is a serious game changer for breakfast smoothies and protein smoothies, and I'm going to share my honest opinion on them because that's what we do here. I've tried smoothie and protein powder before, but what made me stop buying the brand that I had been was because I realized how many added ingredients and sugar was really in the powder.
Thankfully, I don't have to worry about that with Earthchimp. Earthchimp uses all organic ingredients, and you can actually pronounce all of them, unlike some brands. They are packed with protein and fiber and have a billion probiotics, no gum, no added sugar. But what's really great is that they don't taste planty. They don't taste chalky or salty. It doesn't taste like you're eating as healthy as you are, which is exactly what I need. And this is so fun. With every order placed, Earthchimp plants a tree. Even aside from all the benefits, Earthchimp is literally so easy to make. Today I decided to use my shaker and just mix some vanilla Earthchimp with some almond milk, and it was so good. This small cup filled me up so fast. I was actually really surprised that it did. I dragged out the process of making this because I'm easily distracted, but it took me maybe 5 minutes, even lollygagging like I was. So as a busy college student, I cannot wait to be able to quickly whip this up on my busy mornings and take it with me to class. I've linked below the Earthchimp website for y'all to go ahead and grab some protein powder at a great price for a great amount. So if you're looking for a quick breakfast for your busy life, let Earthchimp help you out. Okay, now back to the video.
So Marie definitely began to have fun at Versailles. She dressed very beautifully in lots of fine silk, and it was around this time that she became known for how extravagant she was in fashion. She was known for her ginormous powdered wigs and humongous frilled dresses. But again, I do think that some of the way that our culture, especially now, views Marie Antoinette and her spending is a little exaggerated, especially when you look at a lot of our celebrity icons of today. Because yes, Marie spent an outrageous amount of money for sure, but she wasn't so self-centered as people make her out to be. In 1783, an area known as the Queen's Hamlet was built in Versailles, built in response to Marie beginning to yearn for a bit of a simpler lifestyle. She was used to the lavish lifestyle of Versailles, and she was, quite frankly, kind of bored. Queen's Hamlet was like Marie's own little country, a little place to get away. It was a countryside, it had watermills and farms. But what was cool about the Queen's Hamlet is it did have a working farm that provided jobs for a lot of people. But it was kind of seen like Marie and her friends who visited with her were playing poor or playing farmer, and it didn't set well with the French people. It was seen as if being queen of a country was too boring and she needed to play peasant, basically. And this was another event that really solidified the public disinterest in Marie. The last event that really solidified the public's hate for Marie was an affair that would later become known as the Affair of the Diamond Necklace. It's a little complicated, so stay with me. Back in 1772, when Louis XV commissioned this outrageously expensive diamond necklace for a woman who's known as Madame du Barry, and Madame du Barry was his mistress. Believe it or not, having a mistress as a king at the time was actually accepted by society, and even the king's wife, or wives of kings, it wasn't seen as this scandal. It was actually what was kind of expected. I'll give some credit to Marie's husband. He never took a mistress. He had zero interest, and he was kind of seen as odd for doing so. He was seen as eccentric for making this very odd choice. But back to the necklace. The commission for this necklace was so outrageously expensive, and it called for very specific diamonds that were also incredibly expensive, that the diamonds were not able to be sourced for several years after its commission. Before the piece was finished and paid for, Louis XV died. So the royal jewelers, why can't I say this? The royal jewelers first offered the piece to Marie as a gift, but she refused the gift, saying, quote, "We have more need for ships than diamond necklaces." However, a little later down the road, a known trickster by the name of Jean de Valois Saint Remy. Sorry if I butcher that. I'll just call her Jean. Jean forged Marie's signature, and rumor began to spread very, very fast among France that Marie had ordered this necklace for herself and then refused to pay for it. And yes, Jean was eventually convicted of her crime, but the damage had already been done. This was really the final straw that broke the camel's back, and the French people really hated Marie after this. She even gained a new nickname. She was now known as Madame Deficit. The French Revolution soon began, and Marie and Louis were the targets. So as the chaos is unfolding around France and this revolution is really starting to get bigger and bigger, the people who were high status royals, high in aristocracy who lived in Versailles were trying to get out. They needed to leave, they needed to get away, and they were trying to convince Marie and Louis to do the same. But Louis swore that he was still loved by the French people, and Marie refused to leave his side. But in October of 1789, a mob stormed Versailles. They broke down the Golden Gate outside of Versailles and were able to make it into the palace. Marie barely escaped the mob. She grabbed her children and ran to Louis's bedroom, where they hid. The mob was eventually pushed out of the palace, but it quickly reformed in the courtyard, kind of under the balcony in the bedroom that they were hiding in. So this is the time that you might remember that famous scene from Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette film. And this is that scene where Marie Antoinette comes out onto the balcony and bows to the French people. This didn't happen, but I actually like what happened a little bit better. So the crowd below the balcony was shouting, screaming. It was absolute chaos, and they were demanding to see their queen. They wanted to see her. So Marie gathered her wits, and she was terrified, but she walked out onto the balcony, and she just stood there defiantly and stared back at the French people. She didn't say anything. She didn't do anything. And this actually worked out a little bit in her favor, even if only for a moment. This really presented her to be this strong queen that the French people weren't expecting. The French people hardly ever saw Marie and Louis. So just based off of all the rumors and everything they heard, they were really expecting this kind of fragile, fearful little girl who was playing queen. But what they instead saw was a very strong, defiant woman. And it is even said that for the first time, shouts from the crowd began saying, "Long live the queen." But even so, the mob had demands, and their main demand was that Marie and Louis needed to leave Versailles immediately. And they obliged. And within hours, Marie and Louis were in a carriage and leaving Versailles with their children. A mob escorted them out of Versailles, and they were placed under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace. But even under this arrest, Marie was really holding on to hope, especially for a future for her children. Marie really knew all along that these uprisings were gonna have to force them to leave France. But like I previously said, Louis refused to leave the country. But I think he was kind of understanding now that they don't love you. You're not the king that you think you are. And Marie was finally able to convince him that they needed to leave. In a last attempt to flee, Marie and Louis disguised themselves as a valet and a governess, and they attempted to leave in a carriage. It didn't go well. They were not at all successful and were very quickly captured and returned to Paris. This is due to some bad judgment planning from Louis and some really bad timing. So when they were captured, a crowd had kind of gathered to see what on earth is happening, and instead of being angry, the crowd was shocked. They could not believe that the king of their country was attempting to flee. And this really solidified even more disdain for their king and queen. And Louis lost all credibility that he had as king after this. On August 13th, the family was sent to Temple Prison, and this is where the family would be held until their deaths. On January 21st, Louis was executed via guillotine, and Marie would only be told about his death when they returned his wedding ring to her. For several months, Marie was held in this prison. She was eventually separated from her children, to her absolute dismay. So the combination of no longer being able to be with her children and all of this combined just really caused Marie to go into a deep depression and mourning. But Marie was still holding on to hope that her and her children would be exiled instead of executed. Now, we all know that this unfortunately was not Marie's fate. And on October 16th of 1793, Marie was set to be executed. On the day of Marie's execution, she wore nothing but a simple white gown. Her hair was cut and covered with a bonnet, and her hands were bound. She was paraded through Paris until she reached the spot of her execution, and her last words really remind you of who she was, and especially young Marie, how she was known as her family. Small and gentle, polite, and trying to do her best. In her last moments, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the man who would execute her, and she muttered the word, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." At 12:15 p.m., Marie was beheaded. This left Marie's children still imprisoned without a mother or a father. Her son would die soon after her, and his story is an interesting one in itself, specifically his last little while. He was treated very bad in prison. He was assaulted on many different accounts by many different people in the prison, and unfortunately picked up an illness from some other prisoners and died of that illness in the prison. But Marie also had 2 daughters who were left behind, and they would both outlive their parents and go on to lead relatively happy lives. Marie does not have any direct descendants, but even though Marie doesn't have any direct descendants, she still has left behind a good bit of her own personal things. Over the years, things like her shoe, corset, her gowns have been found, and of course her bedroom is still intact in Versailles. And looking at these items, it really just makes it easier to realize that this was a real person. This isn't just some pop culture icon, a coquette icon of Gen Z. She was a real girl, and she went through real struggles. The most fascinating thing, in my opinion, that was left behind for Marie was her death mask that was performed shortly after her death, and it was done by Madame Tussauds. What's really interesting about the death mask is this is going to be the most accurate interpretation we have of what Marie actually looked like. Now, she had been imprisoned for months leading up to her execution, of course, so her death mask is not going to look the way she did when she was in her prime as queen. She was said to have become sickly pale, very malnourished, and her hair had begun to gray, but we can still get a general feel for what she looked like, which is very interesting when you compare it with her portraits, and it really becomes clear what kind of stylistic liberties were taking at the time, such as very large eyes or more pouty lips. She had this beautiful hooked nose that often wasn't depicted as it truly was in her portraits, but she did have beautiful blue eyes that you can see in her portrait. These stylistic liberties were used specifically for kings and queens to try to make them look as beautiful as possible because of who they were. But even though Marie wasn't really beautiful by today's standards necessarily, I think she was really beautiful. She was said to have had long strawberry blonde hair beneath her powdered wigs. Lastly, there's this image that I would like to address that is often associated with Marie Antoinette, and it's this one right here. Because I've seen a lot of videos saying that this is Marie Antoinette's head, and it is not. But it is another French princess who was also named Marie. Marie Therese Louise of Savoy is who is seen in these pictures. I'm going to call her Therese as I explain her a little bit, just because if I call her Marie, it's going to be confusing because we're also going to talk about Marie Antoinette. So I'm going to call her Therese for that purpose. So Marie was actually really great friends with Therese, and Therese was a part of that high aristocracy that fled Versailles and tried to convince Marie and Louis to do the same. But what's interesting about Therese is she actually returned to Versailles in support of Marie when the uprisings were growing in size. But unfortunately, her timing was awful, and she returned just before Marie and Louis were going to be arrested and imprisoned. So naturally, Therese was sent to prison as well because she was such a close friend of Marie's. She really was associated with her. So Therese was sent to trial, and she was said to express her disdain for Marie and Louis, and she refused to do so. Her family members who were present during her trial were really urging her, just say it so that your life can be spared, and she refused to because Marie was a really close friend of hers. Therese said that she was happy to die if it meant defending her friend, but no one could have prepared her for the massacre that awaited her outside of the courtroom. When she walked out of the courtroom door, she was escorted by 2 guards straight into a massacre. She was hit on the head with a metal pipe and beaten by the crowd that surrounded her. She then fell to the ground in agony, crying out, "I'm lost." The crowd then began stabbing her repeatedly until she died. The treatment of Therese's body is appalling. After she died, her body was dragged away from the massacre, was stripped of its clothes, she was undressed and beheaded. Her head was then placed on a metal spike and paraded around Paris. They specifically paraded Therese's head around underneath the window that Marie was imprisoned in, holding it up just enough in the window for Marie to see. Luckily, Marie was not in the room at the time, so she didn't see this happening. But when she was informed of it later, she was devastated, and it was said that she screamed and cried in agony. So there's that unfortunate story. I really don't see Marie as the villain that a lot of people make her out to be, because was it really her fault? Of course, she's not entirely blameless. She spent a lot of money. She did ignore a lot of things, but also the institution that was really raising her kind of hid a lot of things from her. So a lot of it was out of her control. But I do really see Marie as much more of a tragedy than this menace. But those are just my thoughts. If you have any thoughts and want to start a conversation, leave a comment down below. If you made it this far in the video, thank you. Leave a pink heart in the comments so that I know that you made it this far and I can show your comments some extra love and appreciation. Let me know if you enjoyed this kind of historical commentary, because I certainly did. Some other historical figures that I would love to speak on in the future are the Romanov family. There's several artists that I would love to speak on. I love the Tudor queens. I would love to speak on them as well. So let me know if that's something that you'd like to see. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys again next time. Bye.